Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tawny Atun Harjo Growing Thunder. I hold the name from my Kiowa people as Tani Astompa'o, which translates to first chosen to be paraded. I am the State of Oklahoma History Center Tribal Liaison and Curator of Ethnology. And I also serve for the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma as a Curator and Museum Director for the Kiowa Tribal Museum. I want to say thank you and welcome to joining us. And we'd like to start with the land acknowledgement of our people of the East of contact and our tribal nations of the United States and the First Nations of Canada, and to acknowledge our Indigenous relatives across the world. I'd also like to extend a preservation acknowledgement for those impacted, serving on the front line, and a reverence for the loss and care for the tribal nations affected by COVID-19, like those of the Navajo Dene Nation, the Kiowa Koigu tribe, and all the other sovereign rights of those who have closed their borders within Indian country to preserve our culture, language, and land. Our goal today is to give a voice to the 574 federally recognized tribes, sovereign nations of the United States. For key people in the arts, often these conversations leave out First Americans, and we in museums discover the problems of curation only after the fact. Let me share about the mechanics of today's discussion. We have 4 amazing curators who will share what they have learned, experienced, and what to include when curating indigeneity. I'd like to introduce to you Nancy Marie Maithlo, America Meredith, Mario A. Caro, and Deborah Yipupapan. We will be examining how Indian country, hold on, I lost my screen. How Indian country and peoples of color are disproportionately represented. We will provide the voice of resilience, hope, and community building. We will offer a takeaway and native-led solutions. These will be brief conversations, but that is by design so that we can connect with each other as an organization, to connect with you, to create resources, and to make sure that there is comfort between the level of our voice in Indian country to develop trust for our efforts as tribal nations. To include this disclaimer, please note that all viewpoints expressed in this conference are those of each individual speaker and do not reflect the opinions or viewpoints of the AAMC or the AAMC Foundation. There are a variety of challenges and a breadth of solutions. At the end of this discussion, we will leave 15 minutes for questions and answers. Please enter your questions into the chat area in the first 30 minutes, and we will make selections to answer and also provide our information if you would like to connect following today's session. I say aho and thank you and enjoy your session today. If you'd like to go ahead and start, Nancy, Deborah, America, Mario.
I could just start by briefly saying thank you to the Art Curator Conference for inviting this conversation. And also, thank you, Tani, for serving as our moderator today. I'm very grateful. And just to mirror your comments that we're all professionals in the field and I'm open to having conversations even after this session. I think most folks could find us on the internet. So let's continue the conversation even after today.
I agree. I'd like to say thank you also to AAMC and thank you, Tani, for the invitation. I'm honored to be speaking on this topic with all of you. So yeah, I'm looking forward.
Okay, so if we outlined a few statements in which we're going to share today, and that number 1 being Native American voices are necessary in curating, caring for, and interpreting Native American art. Who would like to start? I'm gonna call
You're on mute, America.
America.
Hello? I started and got cut off. But anyway, I think this is extremely obvious to all of us, but I don't think it's obvious to the general public. And unfortunately, the scholarship is such that you cannot gain a lifetime's worth of experience with the incredibly diverse Native peoples within just our own country, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. And then of course the oceanic people, you know, Hawaii, all the Polynesian people are not federally recognized, so you have to add them as well. But just that you can go to school forever and you're never gonna gain the life experience. So I think Native people in this day and age, Native voices always have to be. We can't go back. You cannot have an outside expert ever speak on behalf of Native peoples.
Yeah, part of the discussion we had amongst ourselves, you know, focused on why, you know, what is unique about Native curation. And one of the things that seemed to be obvious and a kind of common observation from us is that that it has to do with the relationship that person will have with the community. You know, the kinds of relationship where you know, you stand to be you know, hold yourself accountable to that community. So that's a little bit of a different kind of a relationship than most folks have when they're curating either an individual artist or something that has to do with you know, a broader cultural representation.
Yeah, and in our conversations, we were talking about worldview and different worldviews, and how as Native people, we have a different kind of worldview that we bring into whatever it is that we do. I don't know if everyone was tuned into the first panel discussion, but I was just really blown away by hearing Tonya Willard talk about her practice and how, you know, she's also an artist, and she curated, you know, within one of those kinds of institutions with white walls, but then how, you know, she took that out. She took her practice out of those white walls, and, you know, she used the term recentering. So she was recentering that art back into Native community. And something like that, I think, you know, that comes from having that, you know, that Indigenous worldview and centering community, you know, at the heart of your practice. And, you know, that was something else that we had talked about, was just that accountability that we have as Native and Indigenous people to our communities. We're not just, you know, accountable to the institutions we work for, but, you know, I think, you know, for myself and the work that I do at the Field Museum in community engagement, I know that my community is watching me and watching the work that I do. So that really, you know, that really motivates me to do the best that I can for them while I'm inside that institution. And, you know, I believe that, or I would hope that, you know, that's something that a Native American curator would bring into the institutions as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that there's a misperception when we talk about community standards as there being somehow a lack of freedom under an individuality frame. And, you know, I think especially given the pandemic, which we are all really suffering and dealing with now, I think it's very clear, it's very transparent that we are all connected. And this is a part of Indigenous lifeways, knowledge, centering that I think is very valuable for our world, and that also we should keep in mind. You know, I read so many critical assessments of Native art exhibits that are working under a completely different frame of reception than what I see as functional in Indigenous arts. And so I think there has to be a recentering there as well.
You're on mute, Tani.
Oh no.
Darn.
Here,
Okay.
you're back.
Back.
Yay.
Okay, how is the term Native American defined in the United States?
And again, some of these things seem obvious, but I think they really aren't. And I think all these words like American Indian actually mean something. So it does seem like the shift is towards Indigenous peoples. That's definitely coming out of Canada, and Indigenous peoples of the Americas. So all these different terms are overlapping, but they all mean something very precise and very different. And Native American is a term used in the United States and in Panama. Panamanians use it to discuss Indigenous people of Panama. In the United States, is used as Indigenous peoples of the United States. So it includes Chamorro and Guamanian and Native Hawaiians. So when people talk about, you'll hear American Indian and Alaskan Native, that is because Inuit people, Yup'ik people, and Unangan people are not American Indians. So there's a linguistic, genetic, cultural difference and historical difference. In Canada, you get, there's wonderful funding and publishing and incredibly articulate information coming out from Canada, but Canadians can't speak for myself or other tribes that are down here. So we do use the term American Indian. And when you look at, do familiarize yourself, please, with the tribes that are here and the names that they choose. The sovereign entities choose to use the name Indian in their own name. So the Kiowa Nation isn't the Kiowa Nation. The Kiowa people have decided that they wish to call themselves the Kiowa Indian tribe. So I think we need to honor that. So American Indian is not obsolete in the United States. I don't know if other people want to add.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm in the academic world. I'm doing a lot of publishing. I've been honored to publish with many of you here on the panel. And recently I had received an outside blind peer review that really objected to my using the term American Indian. And, I was speaking of artists in context of the Institute of American Indian Arts, the University of California, Los Angeles American Indian Center. I mean, that is my place of employment. And the fact that I kind of had to fight to keep in the name that exists and that I work under seemed kind of ludicrous to me. And so while I, in the classroom, will tell students it's not really that theoretically valuable, because I think a lot of people get stuck there and they don't go on to the other topics I want them to learn about. I think it is really critical that we continue to be able to be named in the ways that we choose to be named.
And First American art, we deal with so many different people. We deal with the Americas, so Greenland down to Tierra del Fuego. And our style guide's online and available for anyone's use. But we also negotiate. So if people feel adamantly that they do not like a certain term, we will not use it to describe them. We have to honor individuals and tribes as well. And segueing into the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act that was passed in 1990. That was fought for tooth and nail by Native peoples. The outside world doesn't care. Non-Native people don't care. So institutions kind of act like it's optional to follow this law, even though it's a felony to break the law. And there's discussion that was to keep, foreign jewelers, from marketing things. It was designed by Native people to keep non-Native people from claiming our identity. That's the final death knell, for our people is, stealing our history, stealing our spirituality, and then assuming our own identity. And it's been going on for centuries. So I just want to bring that up, that is a Native initiative.
So one thing that we want to help the audience explain is how do we define ourselves as American Indian? So we have the laws under the Department of Interior, which specify you are a member of a federally recognized tribe. Do you want to share with that and how you can identify and be authenticated?
So the law was a great many people were involved in the consultation. So it allows for sovereignty of tribes. So if someone's not enrolled in a tribe can designate, and they do all the time, they designate tribal artisans. So that individual has the approval and support of a tribal community. So it allows that flexibility on purpose.
Okay, Nancy, would you like to share a little bit of the process of how you become a member of a tribe?
Well, I was going to just speak briefly to the issue of fraud, which is something that we've all, I think, been active with. There are new resources coming forward. So for the audience members, there's a special journal issue of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal that will come out in September with resources about fraud. I think that this is a real issue for us. Again, I think individual freedom and other kinds of means of reception of individuality get in the way of this conversation, but we really do need to have this conversation because it is a real thing. And Tonya, I would just maybe pass it back to you about funding issues and how funding is being allocated according to Native identity, but maybe Native identity that's questionable from the communities that they claim.
Well, one thing that we always want to encourage and share, and we provide as a resource as a group between individuals here presenting today, is that Native American identity holds federal recognition that each of us are enrolled members of our tribe. And you cannot just decide one day, I'm going to be Native American, or you cannot decide that you are 7 generations out from a great grandparent who might have been Native and decide today you want to be Native American, because we hold identifications with our tribes of which we are enrolled with at birth by our parents, or we can go through the family tree process, which tells you who your relative was that was enrolled with your tribe. And that stands true for all 574 tribes within the United States. First Nations of Canada have their own roll system, but in the United States specifically, for our employment, for our measures to even to attend school, public school, university, trade school, even home ownership, we have to have these identifications in order for us to be federally recognized individuals with authentication. And these laws are in place, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act law, and our museums should be corresponding, and they should be following the guidelines of which have been placed there by our many relatives who fought for these laws to be in place, but also the hiring practices and funding practices which are in place for art museums and museums in general. Deborah, do you want to share a little bit also about what we were talking about with the investment of our community?
Yeah. And I think, we were also talking about just, so with that process too, in hiring Native people in institutions and looking at, Native artists as well, there needs to be that kind of vetting process too. And checking and, making sure that somebody is not violating the Indian Arts and Crafts Act and edging out Native artists into, having opportunities to show in major institutions. Those are some things that are very important to think about because, if you're actually for institutions that want to invest in Native American art, they have to invest in Native American artists. And they have to be Native American artists, and I think to properly represent those Native American artists, there needs to be an investment in Native American curators. So we definitely need to have more space in institutions to have Native American curators that can bring in these voices, that can bring in these, that are aware of these types of concerns, that, will not go that route of bringing in, somebody who self-identifies as a Native American artist. Again, because, the Native American curator is going to be accountable to the larger, Native community and to the Native art community, I think is something that's really, important and a really important part of, doing that work.
Yeah, let me just chime in about this whole notion of self-identification, because I think, those of us who are in academia, for some time, have been talking about the performativity of identity, right? The sort of anti-essentialist argument that, one is not intrinsically, a particular subject, but one, has agency in kind of enunciating their identity. However, what we're talking about here is a national identity. It has more to do with, being acknowledged by a governmental entity that has sovereignty over its membership. So it's not the kind of thing where you can just feel like today I'm gonna wake up and claim being French or something. It really is about it's a completely different paradigm in terms of thinking about identity, because otherwise you end up playing Indian doesn't get you that kind of acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I think for our audience members, I mean, a really useful metaphor paradigm to think about is that the status that we're referencing of belonging is probably best viewed through the frame of being a diplomat from a nation. And so just as you would receive a diplomat from any foreign nation outside the US, you should be receiving probably tribal members in the same fashion. University of California now has a representative to the chancellor, and that kind of status is definitely present in recognition of this being a land grant university. So you're seeing this being enacted, I think, more readily. It's more visible now, and there are many best practices that are out there. Again, audience members can be in touch with us if they need more resources, but thinking about this is how would you receive someone who is visiting your country from elsewhere? What kind of protocols, what kind of dignity would you afford to that person? Because I think we could all speak to instances where we've tried to access collections, where we've presented our professional materials, and there's a disparaging reception. I've had people, laugh when I tell them I'm from a tribal college. They can't even imagine that such a thing exists. And so I think, people really being able to recognize their center of whiteness and being able to step back and say, I really don't know enough to speak knowledgeably, and can you help me, is a really great impulse to have.
And a very pragmatic part of this in terms of museum practices is the label. All right. I mean, when you have a label that identifies an artist, often it's followed by a national identity in parentheses, right? So not to acknowledge the native nation there, but instead put in the name of the colonizer, is once again enacting colonization. So
I think it's important too to build up on what you all are talking about, that the art world tends to be very centered in urban areas, and Indian country is very scattered, totally land-based, and many of the most knowledgeable areas, core cultural areas, are extremely rural and underfunded. I think tribal museums and cultural centers are an incredible resource for mainstream art museums to tap. And they're made for interfacing with the public. So I would definitely reach out to them and talk to them as much as possible. They're there. So in the idea of diplomats, the cultural centers and the tribal museums are the embassies.
I think along the lines of the, treating Native visitors into institutions, as RSV, just VIPs, I think this is something that, I would love to push for every institution, every non-Native institution in this country to have somebody in my role, like somebody who does Native community engagement. Somebody who, makes the space welcoming for Native people to come into, because, maybe one of the questions we're asking is, why don't we have enough Native American curators? And maybe it's because Native youth and Native young people, don't feel welcome when they come into these institutions. They don't feel like there are programs that are, put in place to set them up to become, Native curators. So it's not something that they really, think that they can aspire to, because, they don't feel welcome in these institutions. And so I think one of the things that we could really, really push is, to have institutions, mainstream non-Native institutions, create more programming, to engage their local Native communities and their local Native youth, and you know, build those Native curators, you know, from that community and from that youth. But I think that comes from having that partnership and that relationship with those communities. And part of that way is, you know, hiring Native people, you know, to be those point of contacts for those communities, to be the liaison for those communities, and to do that outreach. And, you know, that's definitely something that I try to do at the Field Museum. And so that's what I do in my role is, you know, I welcome and invite Native people to come to the museum, to access collections, and, you know, to visit their ancestors and relatives in collections. And, you know, I'm hoping that maybe from the youth groups that I've invited to come and do that, maybe some of them will aspire to, you know, want to, you know, seek a profession in museums and, you know, help change these institutions.
Yeah, I would just add to that in terms of, you know, adding to diplomatic status, this sort of professionalization of the field. And I think exactly bringing people into collections is, and especially the youth, is really critical. One thing that I would warn against, I don't know what the other panelists think about this, I see a lot of resource extraction happen at those moments sometimes that's inappropriate, you know, so, you know, come visit our museum, we just want to talk to you. And by the way, while you're here, can you identify all these objects? Can we tape you identifying these objects? Can we video you identifying these objects? And so you get into a situation where someone is being hosted, and then all of a sudden they're laboring. And so that work is good, but maybe from the front end to be able to say, we want to hire you and contract with you to come into our collections and pay you a fee for a certain number of hours that we plan to labor with you. I mean, it was just a generation ago that our senior artist would be invited into museum collections, and literally, you know, I have stories of some of them, you know, and an anthropologist basically asking for a blood sample for a DNA study, you know, while they're in the collections trying to see the material. You know, that was not uncommon a generation ago. I mean, this is how egregious this field can be. And so this, you know, enact professionalism with your Native American visitors in the same way that you enact professionalism with anyone you think you was a peer. And so I think the fact that we receive these really kind of problematic types of reception is just more evidence that our field is not taken seriously as a professional field.
So to move to our next question, what is collaboration? What do you feel is the stream of collaboration that will work for both groups?
I know, Nancy, I thought you had.
No.
I do. I'm trying to be polite and not keep jumping.
We want to hear you. We invite you, please.
Well, okay,
Taking your blood.
So collaboration basically means that you're going to give up your power. And if you're in a position of power in a mainstream institution, in an art institution, and you tell me, which I've heard from curators and representatives, administrators, like, I'm going to make sure that the next generation, there'll be a Native person in this position. That to me is a complete cop-out. Someone should be in that position right now. You need to relinquish your power and be able to be a proactive collaborator. It's kind of like the difference between saying, I'm not racist, and actually being anti-racist. So we're asking folks to be actively collaborating with folks, taking the lead of tribal communities and the lead of Native professionals in the field. And that is absolutely, to be an anti-colonial endeavor, you have to relinquish your power. A, you have to recognize you have that power. And B, you have to say, this is the moment when I step back. My skills are not the skills needed at this moment. And I'm going to give space. And I rarely see that, honestly. I don't know if other folks want to chime in.
Well, I think we've discussed a lot about advisory panels and how diverse they can be and how they could potentially be good and how they can be potentially just wasting people's time. So I think one thing is, if you are the era of like having a bunch of Indians come together and rubber stamp your genius idea is over. Like, if you invite people in, you have to listen to them. So I think from someone who works with museums but is not a museum employee, I've kind of found my own tactics of ways to be listened to a little more, which is after one of these crazy, you know, we've been in several advisory panel discussions where we felt like we were window dressing and it was just checking a box, like, I follow up with an email. Here's what I heard. Here's the actionable items. So, and I know the Zunis and Jim Enote have been really proactive about their cultural center reaches out to museums with Zuni collections and tells them what they have. So not every tribe has the freedom and luxury to do that, but you know, there definitely has to be the dialogue, and to be open to the dialogue and listen is so profoundly important.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a great point. And, you know, that maybe it's, you know, it's a partnership. It's, you know, making space, making way for Native people, you know, to really have their voice be at the forefront, have our voices be at the forefront. And I had a conversation with some friends the other day about the term collaboration, and just how you know, that could be taken in so many different ways. And one of those ways, as you said, America, is, you know, people are being brought in to collaborate to more or less just, you know, check off boxes. But yeah, there has to be a more active component for those collaborators to really take a part in, you know, the decision making and, you know, directing, you know, where an exhibition or an exhibit or something to that effect is going to go. So yeah, you know, I totally agree with both you and Nancy about, you know, there needs to be more space created. You know, people currently are in positions of power where they can create those spaces for Native people. You know, there are a couple instances here in Chicago that, you know, there were perfect opportunities to hire Native people for specific positions that should have gone to Native people. And I know that there were Native people, very qualified people, that applied for those positions and either didn't get called or were not hired. And so those positions both went to non-Native people. So, you know, I mean, institutions can't use the excuse that Native people are not applying for these positions. They are, but those institutions are just, they're not making that choice to hire those particular Native people. So that's something that, you know, I mean, I don't know how to, you know, challenge that.
I mean, I would just share with the audience that we actually know a lot. This group, other groups like us out there, we know when the grants are coming. We know when you ask us to get involved. And we know that if you sat on that grant for 8 months and made all your executive decisions and asked us in the last 2 months, that you're asking us in the last 2 months. And that our kind of contribution is not considered central. So just to know, like, we know so much. And we would be great resources for folks so that they could act ethically. And it's not as though we're out of tune with who's getting hired. I mean, I'm writing letters for people. We're all talking to each other. We know what kinds of decisions are being made. And when these institutions in the future want our collaboration, we actually will know which ones are equitable to work with and which ones aren't equitable. So just, there's no smoke screen. Everything is pretty, I think, transparent in this field, because it is such a small field of Native arts. We do talk to each other. So if you want investment in the long term, then just be very present, I think, right now, and make these changes. And just one last thing, because I want to hear from Mario, is that one way to do this for folks who say they don't have money or time or whatever, be a collaborator so that when you get an opportunity, you share that opportunity with a student, you share that opportunity with a mentee, you share that opportunity with an artist. So if you're asked to do a talk internationally, say, I'm going to bring a student, I'm going to bring an artist with me. And even if they say no, just say, I won't come then if you don't bring someone, because there's a high value of mentorship in our field. And it's surprising when I do this, people find the money for that student or for that mentee or for that artist to come. So I think we all collectively have more power than we like to admit.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add, you know, it's really interesting because obviously the assumption that we have here is that the collaboration is between Native and non-Native, right? And I've been privileged to work with the Longhouse Educational and Cultural Center up here in Washington State, and you know, they do a lot of work that's intranational in terms of, you know, Native nation to Native nation, and international in that we work with folks, not just in North America, but in the Pacific as well, as particularly the Maori. And so when we collaborate on, either residencies or exhibitions or gatherings, the terms of collaboration and the dynamics, are so different in terms of power, right? Our main concern usually is how are we going to do the protocol for this particular gathering? Like how are we? What are the terms that we use to kind of introduce so and so? How do we provide the space for elders to be followed by the young folks? So those are the concerns that you would have in a collaboration that isn't so different in terms of power as it is when you have native to non-native, when you're dealing with these larger institutions.
Okay, so we are going to run short on time, and I want to make sure we answer the questions. But what are some of the ways that museums can better recruit Native American staff?
I think one of the most important things is to acknowledge that there is not a level playing ground. I'm not going to get it right, in access to education. So if you require a PhD, you're going to lose so many people. You're going to have such a small pool of potential people. And does a person necessarily need a PhD to be a curator? When you just go by who has the most advanced degree and who's published the most, there are institutional reasons why non-native people will have published more and will have probably gotten more opportunities in the past. I know the Andrew Mellon Foundation is really trying to rectify that, but that's very recent. So I think you need to be keenly aware that there will not be equal access to education.
Yeah, and there's not equal access to resources. So thank you, Merrick, for bringing up Mellon. My primary complaint with that is that there might be funding for students, but there's no understanding of who's actually going to train that student, who's going to put that student through an academic program. Where are those academic programs? Do we have textbooks? Do we have images on JSTOR? Do we have endowed positions? Do we have multi-year funding for grad students? Those are all lacks. And so we, again, just as America said, we're not operating on an equal playing field. And one of the things that I'd just like to get in quickly that we talked about is the need for there to be more studies and surveys done about the state of the Native arts field. How many folks do have degrees? Where are those people? Are they able to get jobs? Where are the programs that are funding? How much money is in those programs? We're just kind of guessing. We know what we know from our own lived realities. But again, to take our field seriously, we need to have investment in an infrastructure. That investment needs to be substantial, and it needs to be a multi-year investment.
Can we address the Latino question, the Latinx question? And Mario, you probably would be the one.
Which one is it? Okay.
There was a question about how do you deal with Latin American Indigenous artists. So we do cover Indigenous peoples from Latin America, and I think it's all negotiation. I think we really constantly need to have this dialogue, and there's no cut and dry, this will work for all situation answers. There always has to be flexibility and humility, but I love the terms mestizo, mestiza, mestizex, and Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx. So I really wish we had a term for, and people find that offensive, but detribalized people of Indigenous descent. So I use detribalized people of Indigenous descent for people that are not Latin American in that situation. And I definitely use the term of descent. So we just covered an artist, an amazing artist, Thiago Costat. And his grandmother lives in the community. He lived with his grandmother and her family in the Amazon. They're Potiguara, and I apologize for mispronouncing it. So he did not feel comfortable being identified simply as Potiguara. He sees himself as mestizo, so we put mestizo and then / Potiguara. So he knew which community he descends from, and he has a living connection to that community that he felt it was important to identify first as mestizo.
Yeah, I mean, the mestizo is an interesting term, and it has different connotations, whether you use it here in the U.S. or further south, and even within Latin America, it has different kind of tonalities, right? And it's interesting to think about it vis-a-vis the Métis. But I mean, in the U.S., the history of racism in the U.S. is such that, I mean, with miscegenation and all these other one-drop rule, all these, blood quantum, the notion of a mixed identity has been, kind of, at bay forever. So it's not a real current term here. Yeah, terminology is something that we've always been struggling with, against, and through. So yeah.
Okay, and another question is for our friends and colleagues who are in Europe, and how they might incorporate new voices in curation from Native curators and contemporary art in Europe.
I'm not sure about the intent of the question, but I would just say that one of the suggestions that our group had come up with in our planning is that, there are national Native organizations, the Native American Indigenous Studies Association, the Native American Art Studies Association. While we need probably more professional recognition, there are groups, and I would just suggest looking at the conferences that are happening globally and who the leaders are, and contacting them. And again, with an eye towards mentorship. So if you're always bringing someone out, make sure you're bringing a student out with them, or an artist or a collaborator with them at the same time. So it's not just one person. I think we're into a position now where there's like a handful of people, and the same people get called to do the same things over and over and over and over again. And I'm glad that they have those opportunities, but I would really encourage people to broaden your scope and to do the research.
Yeah, I think, and for those people, as you said, like, the same people get called in over and over again. I think it would be nice then too, for those particular people, to defer and to give other people opportunities, to take on whatever that task might be, or, and then that kind of helps expand that network. And that's something that I really try to push, with my non-Native colleagues, is to really just expand. I know it might seem like it's daunting, but really try to expand that network, in Native community and among, as you said, these different, organizations where you can find a lot of these, Native professionals.
And we have a big question here, because it's one thing that we seem like we're always addressing. And how would a contemporary museum or a art museum address and work with an individual who is claiming Native American but not enrolled, or who claims indigeneity behind that? Because, we're often finding the excuse of, well, so go ahead.
Everybody's biting their tongue.
No, I was going to go for it, but Deborah.
Go for it.
I was typing in the answer. So California is the biggest challenge, because very real historical tribes in California didn't have their treaties ratified by the United States. They were drawn up and the US didn't follow through. So California is an exception. So you go by California entities who from one tribe recognizes another. Then a lot of people, it's a group, it's a collective identity. So you can't self-identify. And I use it as an example. I can say I'm Jason Mamia's wife, but he has the say in the matter. It is not one person's claim. So you just leave it off. I mean, that's simple. The art stands on the art itself, and the artist stands on the artists themselves. So you can just leave it off, and if they insist, you can put of self-identified blank descent.
Mario?
I would just go back to my academic stance, which is just do the research when you bring folks on board. Just like with any professional, if they claim they have a degree from a university, typically you want to see some evidence of that, or if someone has done really good work in the past, then you're going to see that in their CV. So, I think often there's something I call an exceptionalism when it comes to Native arts, where folks are like, oh, it's so special, it's so different, it's so rare. Of course they wouldn't have education, of course they wouldn't have experience. And this is, of course, all blatantly racist kinds of assumptions that are being enacted. And we just need to call that out. You know, I mean, look at someone's track record, what they've done in the past, and be really broad about what counts as credible.
Okay, our next question, Deborah probably could answer this, or myself, because we come from tribes and pueblos that are very close together. And one of them is, how do you navigate the competing expectations of Indigenous communities and for institutions in which we work for? So, for instance, I'm Kiowa, and we've always had this line of competitiveness with the Comanche people, or, you know, being from Jemez, do you want Santa Clara speaking on your behalf, or Acoma, or somebody speaking on behalf of our art and our communities? How can we embark on those expectations?
Well, I think maybe this is why having Native curator would be helpful, because I think as Native people, we're always aware of that. You know, just for my own work and what I do here in Chicago, I'm a Pueblo woman from the Southwest living in, you know, the Council of Three Fires homeland, so Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa. And so, you know, and many more, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Meskwaki, anyway. But what I try to do is really advocate for those voices to be heard here. And, you know, I really always try to acknowledge that, you know, those are the voices that need to be privileged. And I would hope that, you know, somebody would do the same for me when they go down to New Mexico and, you know, are, you know, putting together an exhibit or exhibition or something, that they would think about privileging Pueblo voices, you know, like in the Albuquerque or Santa Fe area. You know, those kinds of things are really important to me. And I know that you know, those are things that are important to other Native people as well. So, you know, that's, you know, I just, yeah, I don't know how else to go further into that.
Well, I think that's the big question, who speaks for whom? And I think you always have to be cognizant of that. And we're going to constantly, one person can't speak on behalf of everyone. We all know that, and just negotiating who do you go to. And you're always, always, always going to have to reach out to others and listen and act upon what you hear.
Right. I mean, it's extra work for sure, but it's work that has to be done. You have to think about, you know, who those voices are that you need to privilege and, you know, bring into a space, and you have to actively find those voices.
And,
I would just, go ahead, Mario.
I was just going to say, you know, and these need to be long-term relationships and engagements, you know, to the point where, you know, if you are engaging long enough, you're going to mess up. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to transgress, and that's part of that relationship. You know, how do you then address that? You know, how do you make up for, you know, your shortcomings in a particular situation? So, I mean, I think it requires that level of commitment. Like, you just can't play it safe forever. It really needs that kind of a risk taking. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Mario. I was just going to say that, again, to go back to the individual collective, I think there's something about curating where people feel like it has to be an individual accomplishment. And we all know that's never the case. Even in communities that are not disenfranchised, you know, there's always a network, except it's an invisible network. And we're just calling to be transparent with your networks and to expand those networks to include communities that do have knowledge. And then I'll just say briefly what I typically do in my classes. I talk about curation, American Indian curation, as being long-term, mutually meaningful, reciprocal, and with mentorship. And if you look at those values, then that's a way that I steer myself with projects.
And then if I can jump in and address, which I think we all have a lot to say about recruiting Native American staff. One thing is look at the existing professional organizations. So the Native American Art Studies Association is one. The Association of Tribal Museum Libraries, oh God, Libraries, Museums, and Archives, I probably garbled that, ATOM. That's another one. Programs such as the Institute of American Indian Arts has an incredible museum studies program. So I would talk to the people in that program and ask who they recommend, because they definitely track their alumni. And also advertising the job. Where are you putting that? Because I think people are overwhelmed by how many applications they get, so they're really restrictive, just like wanting people to have a PhD. So I would advertise in tribal journals would be an important thing for your region.
And maybe we could just say something briefly about some of the opportunities that exist to go into a major urban center for 2 years. On a salary that is an unlivable salary. Again, we see this across the board, but for Native folks, you know, especially people who have children or have communities they're responsible for, you may not be getting candidates because those folks literally cannot live on the salary that you're offering. That salary is, we all know, based upon very selective communities that have extended family that are giving free housing or support monthly or something. Many Native professionals don't have access to that.
And people have kids and relatives, yeah.
Well, we have one question that we need to follow up with, and then we'll give our resources of how we can stay connected as a group. But there's one question about where do we even start? So there's museums that recognize they have gaps in their collections, or they might not even had included Indigenous art or Native American art into their collections. What would be a way for them to begin?
Call up and ask as soon as we can go out again. Well, maybe you can Skype, but get a hold of your closest tribal museum and reach out to the staff from them.
Yeah, I think, you know, this notion of, you know, starting from where you are is really important. You know, your site specific institute, like, you know, you're sited somewhere and you have that a responsibility to that place, that land, and the people there. And so that's a good place to start, right there where you are.
Yeah, and I'm not really an advocate of collection-based curation, but if you're an institution and you have collections that are Native collections, it's beholden upon you to be able to treat those collections properly. And so even just starting with what you have and finding which ones are probably in the most need of curatorial care and reaching out to those tribes. I mean, I tell students all the time when they ask, how do I get a hold of, you know, someone, I'll say, what would you do anyway to buy a pair of sneakers or something? You would Google it. You know, tribes have websites, they have phone numbers. So I think in some ways it's sort of a, in my mind, I'm a little, I don't know, suspect. Just call people, reach out, get on the internet. Again, don't use the exceptionalism argument. You don't have to go pray and be in a sweat and have some faux sense of I'm doing something very Native here. It's just, you know, treat us like real folks.
Yeah, I invest in your local communities. You're making land acknowledgements. There's so many institutions now that are making land acknowledgements. And why are they doing that? So what should be the next step? The next step then is to reach out to those communities that might still be there and have artists in those communities that can be invested in. And you know, youth that can be nurtured.
And I think
the land so just real quick, the land acknowledgement thing. I saw that Tonya in the previous panel was kind of reticent to do that, and I think, you know, that might come from the way in which it's become a, you know, really kind of pro forma, just gesture. But I think you really need to. Yeah.
And just really quickly, in the United States, Canada doesn't have this as much. Relocation, forced relocation, ethnic cleansing. So the tribes are all here. They're in Oklahoma, not all of them, but you need to know your local history. And if the tribe has been removed, like if you're from New York, there's many Delaware tribes. The Delaware Nation is in Anadarko, Oklahoma. The Delaware Tribe of Indians is in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. The Peoria Nation is here in Oklahoma. So you need to acknowledge forced relocation may have been happening, and your institution may be on land where the tribe's doing just fine. They're alive, but you're gonna have to reach out to somewhere across the United States where they've been forcibly relocated and ethnically cleansed from your area.
And I would just add briefly, there's some really exciting mapping projects going on where folks can actually go and get resources from some very proactive new geographies that are being produced as educational resources.
And they're not perfect.
Yeah.
They are not perfect by a long shot.
Yeah.
Work in progress.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I want to share with our visitors who are online that we are currently working on some resources to offer to Judith and the AAMC, which if you have a question about land acknowledgement, if you have questions about tribal engagement, I am the tribal liaison for Oklahoma, and I do hold those phone numbers for the specific cultural centers, museums, tribal nations. And feel free to reach out to us. I'm on the directory, but we also have various engagement methods and how we can stay in touch. America is the editor of the First American Art magazine. Deborah is a community engagement leader at the Field Museum. Nancy is a professor at UCLA, and Mario is also a professor at MIT. So we're all across the country here. You can always stay in touch. But if you even have those difficult questions of what we should do, don't hesitate to reach out, because we want to make sure that our institutions are staying on the top of what needs to be done. But we also don't want you to get in trouble when it comes to these laws, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. There's some hefty fines that are involved, and we want to keep our museums on the straight and narrow, and that we make sure that we work together collaboratively. And I want to say thank you to all for joining us today. Ado.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Yay.
Thanks.